If you've been watching the news cycle at all lately, you might have this really unsettling feeling that the foundations of just rational conversation are crumbling.
Right?
It's not
Yeah.
even that we disagree on things like tax rates or healthcare policy anymore.
No, it's more fundamental.
It's that we can't even seem to agree on the starting facts. And if you feel that, you are exactly where we need you to be, because that feeling, that disarray is the core conflict we're diving into today.
That sentiment, that feeling that our basic shared reality is under attack, is actually the primary observation running through this huge stack of source material that we've gathered. And it really highlights the inherent challenge of modern governance. I mean, look, every human, and yes, every president, has engaged in some kind of deception.
Of course, that's politics.
But our sources are telling us there's a fundamental act of civic responsibility for all of us now, and that's distinguishing between let's call it a trivial political lie, standard historical spin, and what the academic analysis calls an egregious false statement.
Right.
Okay, so we are moving well past conventional political spin. So our mission today is a deep dive into these recent seismic shifts in American power dynamics.
Yeah.
We're going to be tracking the unprecedented intersection of political rhetoric, specifically how language is deliberately weaponized to destroy credibility, with these complex cascading legal challenges and the severe tangible fallout from policy disruptions.
Things like paralyzing government shutdowns and mass deportations.
Exactly.
And this is a massive, complex body of material, and I think the scope is necessary because the events it covers are, frankly, historically unique. We have to connect the modern political realities from, say, the intentional use of insults all the way to the systematic undermining of our institutions with the foundational constitutional arguments the American experiment was built on.
Arguments explicitly formulated against consolidated monarchical power.
It's a shortcut to being comprehensively well-informed, targeted directly at you, the listener, who needs the facts organized and synthesized without all the noise. Now, we here at Neon Core Media know that our sister series, The Debate, will be putting this audio under the scope soon after we record. And, well, the critics are always waiting.
Oh, they are.
So we're not holding back. We are going hard on the facts right out of the gate. Let's jump right into the rhetorical landscape the moment rational discourse just ended.
So we should probably start with the baseline established by James Fifner's analysis. And the baseline is simple. All presidents lie.
Okay, that's the starting point.
Yeah. Fifner categorized historical presidential deceptions as covering a whole spectrum. Sometimes it was about protecting national security. Sometimes it was simple policy deception, or, sometimes just avoiding personal or political embarrassment. That was the conventional model.
Okay, so that's the historical context we're all sort of used to. What changed? Where did the conventional lie, the kind we almost reluctantly accepted as just, political theater, where did that end?
The change is really twofold. It's rooted in volume and in substance.
Volume and substance. Okay.
Fifner's analysis noted that Donald Trump's volume of even those conventional lies vastly exceeds those of previous presidents. But critically, the substance changed. The most significant falsehoods told are characterized not as lies, but as egregious false statements.
And what makes them egregious? Because that feels like the key technical distinction here.
They are statements that are demonstrably contrary to well-known facts. This isn't just, shading the truth or projecting optimism about a policy's success.
Yeah.
This is contradicting basic, verifiable reality. And the source material really emphasizes this consequence. If there are no agreed-upon facts, if, say, the sun rising tomorrow is suddenly a political opinion, then people cannot make informed collective judgments about their government or their leaders.
And if those informed judgments become impossible, what's the conclusion the research draws?
The conclusion is stark. Political power, rather than rational discourse, then becomes the arbiter. When truth is gone, raw power is the only thing left to settle disputes.
Yeah.
And this intellectual decay, it's fundamentally connected to the intentional dismantling of the institutions that are designed to hold that power accountable.
Namely, the media.
Namely, the media.
So let's unpack the anatomy of that attack.
Well, it was a direct, explicit, and repeated campaign. In 2017, the executive declared the fake news media to be the enemy of the American people.
A phrase he repeated at CPAC that year. I mean, that's rhetoric you'd normally reserve for, what, foreign adversaries?
Exactly. And on top of that, he repeatedly threatened to open up libel laws, essentially weaponizing the legal system to punish media outlets that dared to cover him critically.
The fascinating thing, and the source material reviews this, is just how transparent the goal of this strategy really was. We actually have the admission of intent.
Yes. That exchange with the reporter Leslie Stahl is pivotal. When she asked him directly why he continued these unrelenting attacks on the U.S. press, Trump stated very candidly, "I do it to discredit you all and demean you all, so when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you."
I mean, that's about as clear as it gets. It's an admission that the rhetorical strategy is specifically designed to preemptively neutralize any fact-based accountability.
It is.
And this strategy, it relies so heavily on insult politics, and our sources really dig into the technical mechanisms of this language, introducing this concept of the perlocutionary effect.
Yes. And we need to pause on this concept because it's so vital for understanding the strategy. The analysis of his rhetoric identifies that the insults are not primarily geared toward annoying the opponent in front of him.
Right.
They are aimed at producing a perlocutionary effect.
So if I'm tracking the material correctly, that means the effect is achieved not on the person being spoken to, but on a third party, the audience, the voters.
Precisely. It's persuading that third party that the targeted opponent lacks credibility or sympathy or respect. You have to think of it less like a debate between two policymakers.
And more like a performance.
Yes, a performance interaction broadcast to tens or hundreds of millions of potential voters. The insult is the message, and the listener is the target of the persuasion.
That reframes the entire interaction. It's not about winning an argument. It's about building a brand around your opponent that voters can just immediately dismiss.
That's it.
So what does the rhetorical toolkit look like to achieve this perlocutionary effect?
It relies heavily on nicknaming. That's the strategy used to make these derisive monikers stick and become shorthand for the opponent's perceived flaws.
The sources list examples like choker, lightweight, or spoiled brat.
Right, and this strategy effectively reframes the image of political opponents almost instantly, regardless of what their actual policy positions are.
And who are the primary targets of this rhetorical firepower? The data is pretty clear on that, isn't it?
Oh, it's crystal clear. The mainstream media is the most common target, followed closely by political opponents like Hillary Clinton. This tells you exactly where the perceived threats to the narrative and thus to power are located.
And the rhetoric itself. It uses this intense mix of, vitriol, dehumanizing language, fear-mongering.
Especially concerning crime and immigrants. And it relies heavily on false equivalency.
And it often goes well beyond political disagreement, right?
Yeah.
It enters this realm of the apocalyptic or demonic.
Yes. The sources note the comparison of opponents to evil or demonic entities like, in 2025, calling Democrats the party of hate, evil, and Satan. Sociological analysis suggests this is designed to achieve an emotional connection with followers. It's meant to inspire a sense of collective dominance and personal uplift, not to seek rational political compromise.
So let's turn to the scale of this output, which journalists have accurately dubbed the Firehose of Falsehoods. What are the facts on the volume?
The numbers are, they're frankly overwhelming. The Washington Post documented 30,573 false or misleading claims during the first term.
Which averages out to...
What? Over 20.9 per day.
Per day.
And just to provide a contrast, the Toronto Star, which use a much tighter methodology focusing purely on false claims over a shorter period, still tallied 5,276. That's an average of 6.1 per day. The sheer scale is the strategy.
So when you look at that volume, what stands out to you? How did the system even respond to being so completely overwhelmed?
Well, the core challenge was one of scale. The daily average of claims made it statistically impossible for fact-checkers to keep up and maintain the rigor they needed. And on top of that, scholarly analysis of the output, particularly on Twitter, found significant evidence of intent underlying most of the false claims.
Which supports the idea that these were, in fact, deliberate lies.
It does.
And the response from the fact-checking community wasn't just about debunking things one by one. They had to fundamentally pivot their entire operation, didn't they?
They absolutely did. By adopting the term fake news and then applying it to conventionally trustworthy sources like the New York Times or the BBC, the executive successfully redirected the scrutiny. A study of 57 fact-checking groups found that checks on political statements fell by 20% between 2016 and mid-2019, while checks of viral, often emotionally charged online reports surged by 15%.
So they were forced to chase disinformation being spread rapidly online instead of focusing solely on governmental pronouncements.
Yes. They're spending less time scrutinizing policy statements and more time fighting viral nonsense.
And that's a fascinating and, frankly, terrifying trade-off.
And that's the definition of an effective firehose strategy. The Washington Post fact-checkers noted they work almost 2037, and even under that immense pressure, they still can't rate every single claim.
Why not?
Well, especially if the claim involves a prediction, or if it's too vague, or if it relies on an unanswerable question, like, a future court ruling. The primary intent is to create a constant state of informational disarray, just to ensure no single truth can ever gain traction.
So this intentional destruction of shared facts, this whole rhetorical strategy, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It directly facilitates the concentration of power, which leads us really seamlessly into the second major theme in our sources: the adoption of monarchical rhetoric and the use of executive authority to consolidate control.
And the language of absolute authority regarding a potential second term has only intensified. It's moved beyond just political ambition and into a kind of self-described divine mandate.
So let's look at the rhetoric itself. What evidence do our sources provide regarding this likening of the presidency to a higher figure?
Well, we see statements that explicitly push the boundaries of legal and moral accountability. For example, the sources cite this idea that he who saves his country does not violate any law.
Which implies a leader is inherently above the system if he believes his cause is just. That's a classic justification for absolute rule.
It is, and he and his allies have deployed monarchical terminology, including, social media posts depicting him with a crown, and even explicit claims of divine legitimacy.
Like being saved by God to make America great again.
Exactly. And the rhetoric of fear plays a role too. Trump described real power not as influence or diplomacy, but explicitly as fear, noting he doesn't even want to use the word.
This language isn't just provocative, it touches the core tension of the American founding. The entire constitutional experiment was a deliberate rejection of monarchy.
That is precisely the contrast point the sources draw out. We have to go back to Thomas Paine's radical pamphlet, Common Sense, from 1776. Paine argued so vehemently against hereditary succession and monarchy in general, specifically because, in his words, it opens a door to the foolish, the wicked, and the improper.
And Paine's description of the psychology of those born into power, it's incredibly relevant to the concept of the egregious false statement we were just talking about.
Absolutely. Paine warns that those born to reign and others to obey soon grow insolent. Selected from the rest of mankind, their minds are early poisoned by importance.
So they become so insulated by deference and self-importance.
That, Paine argued, they're rendered most ignorant and unfit to govern the complex affairs of a large nation.
That warning that those who feel they are above the law become unfit to rule is the perfect historical counterpoint to the modern claims of absolute immunity.
It is. Paine emphasized the necessity of a large and equal representation, and he warned specifically against the danger of a small, unequal number of representatives. He was citing the risk he saw in the Pennsylvania Assembly at the time.
All of which reinforces the idea that collective, rational decision-making has to prevail over a singular, arbitrary will.
And we also see this idea in John Milton's anti-monarchism.
Right.
Milton's political theory favored a government vested in representative, collective, rational decision-making. His argument against monarchy centered on the idea that true obedience has to be rational. It has to be based on understanding and adhering to a complex body of laws and virtues.
So it can't be blind submission to a single prohibition or, more importantly, a single person.
No. When the executive claims divine authority, it demands exactly the kind of blind submission both Paine and Milton feared most.
So if the rhetoric was trying to establish this kind of singular monarchical authority, where did that rhetoric intersect with the actual levers of executive action? Let's talk about the use of the pardon power, which is probably the most king-like power a president has.
And we see that psychological danger of being poisoned by importance manifest directly in how clemency was used. The sources characterize the abuse of the pardon power as functioning essentially as a reward system.
A tool of loyalty and self-interest?
Yes.
Can you give us the specific examples that detail the connection between wealth and clemency?
Certainly. One of the most striking examples is the pardon of Paul Walczak. He was a former nursing home executive convicted of tax fraud. This pardon was granted shortly after Walczak's mother attended a $1 million a plate dinner at Mar-a-Lago.
$1 million a plate.
The sequence of events strongly suggests that substantial wealth and proximity to power could effectively purchase clemency, which strips the pardon power of its intended function as a tool of mercy or justice.
And the pardons were also explicitly used to reward political loyalty, weren't they? Particularly when it came to actions of violence.
That's correct. Sentences were commuted for 14 members of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers who had been convicted or charged with seditious conspiracy related to violence surrounding the election process.
So when you deploy the pardon power that way, you're essentially validating extreme political actions taken on the executive's behalf.
It transforms it into a political shield for your loyalists.
Which brings us to the most fundamental question raised by the sources regarding this consolidation of power: presidential immunity and the Supreme Court's recent decision in the Trump case.
Yes, the Supreme Court's majority decision in that case has created a presidency that many legal scholars are now arguing is untethered to normal congressional checks and balances.
And the core controversy really centers on defining what constitutes an official act versus a purely criminal act.
It does. Justice Roberts' reasoning trying to draw a line, but it's a very controversial line.
How did the source material criticize that line?
Well, Roberts' reasoning holds that courts can't consider an action unofficial just because it allegedly violates a law. The courts, he says, must only consider whether the action derives from true core powers delegated exclusively to the presidency by the Constitution.
Okay, so, for example, if the president is exercising a power like appointing an ambassador, the claim that he accepted a bribe for that appointment doesn't automatically strip away the immunity related to the official act of the appointment itself.
That is the interpretation.
Yeah.
However, the legal experts we reviewed point out the massive gray area this framework completely fails to address.
Such as?
It offers no guidance on whether Congress could constitutionally criminalize acts that blend official authority with clear self-interest actions, like, say, selling pardons in exchange for personal or political gifts.
Or selling national security secrets to foreign enemies.
Exactly.
Meaning the framework doesn't clarify if the mere act of selling a pardon, which is an official presidential function, falls outside the reach of criminal law enforcement entirely.
That's the problem. The majority decision leaves these critical, potentially criminal actions taken in an official capacity completely unaddressed. And that presents a severe risk of placing the executive above accountability for self-serving actions carried out under the guise of duty.
So this immunity debate, paired with the monarchical rhetoric, suggests a system that is actively trying to shield the powerful from the very consequences the founders warned us about.
I think that's a fair summary.
The concentration of power, well, it inevitably attracts scrutiny, and our sources detail this immense volume of legal challenges faced by the executive. And this isn't just news. It's a critical lens for understanding the transactional nature of power and this blend of official business with personal financial gain.
We have to begin with the New York civil fraud case, which provided a really remarkable paper trail detailing how assets were allegedly valued.
The case alleged that between 2011 and 2021, the organization made over 200 false and misleading valuations of assets in order to defraud banks and insurance companies. So what are the specific alleged inflation examples that illustrate the mechanism of the fraud?
The alleged inflation of Mar-a-Lago's value is probably the most frequently cited example. The organization allegedly inflated its value by perhaps 10 times the true market rate.
How did they do that?
They did it by basing the valuation on its potential as a residential development, despite explicit deed restrictions limiting the property strictly to use as a private social club.
So they ignored the legal restrictions on the property.
Completely. Appraisers are legally required to value it based on its net operating income as a club, not its theoretical resale value as a mega mansion. This is a fundamental violation of valuation standards.
And the alleged inflation of the Manhattan properties was just as stark, wasn't it?
Oh yes, take Trump Park Avenue. The organization valued it at $350 million, which far exceeded a legitimate 2010 valuation of $72.5 million. But the most egregious detail involved 12 rent-stabilized apartments inside that building.
Okay.
A bank appraisal valued these units at $750,000 in total. Yet in their statements of financial condition that they submitted to lenders, the organization claimed those same 12 apartments were worth up to $50 million.
$50 million.
The difference is just colossal, and it suggests an intentional disregard for reality. That gap between $750,000 and $50 million, it really demonstrates how far these egregious false statements can travel from the realm of politics into the realm of high finance. Indeed. The court found them liable for falsifying business records and conspiracy to commit fraud, which led Judge Engoron to order a substantial penalty. Trump was ordered to pay $355 million plus interest, with other defendants paying around $9 million plus interest. And the challenges related to securing the necessary bond for the appeal became this whole public spectacle, which really revealed the practical difficulties of enforcement. The New York Attorney General, increased the requested disgorgement to $370 million and began exploring the seizure of specific assets, like Trump National Golf Club Westchester and the Seven Springs estate.
And the defense lawyers argued that securing the full bond was a practical impossibility.
Right. They cited that some 30 companies had declined to back it, which highlighted the reluctance of financial institutions to assume the risk associated with these assets under those circumstances.
And the AG noted a separate concern about potential asset dissipation, didn't they?
Yes. The AG noted an attempt by the organization to change the addresses of several major entities to Florida, suggesting a move to shield assets from New York jurisdiction. This just further raised concerns about the potential for asset dissipation during the appeal process.
Okay, now, let's quickly chart the status of the 4 major criminal cases detailed in our source material. We can start with the New York State case.
The New York falsifying business records case concluded with Trump being convicted on all 34 felony counts in May 2024. This was related to the hush money payments made before the 2016 election.
Okay. Second, the federal election overturn case in D.C.
He was indicted in August 2023. This case centers on efforts to obstruct the federal certification process of the 2020 election results by relying on knowingly false claims of fraud.
And our sources emphasize that the vice president allegedly told Trump directly that he had seen no evidence of outcome-determinative fraud.
Which speaks directly to the element of intent, the knowing use of falsehoods to try to overturn a democratic result.
Third, the Georgia election interference case. That one's been proceeding despite a recent controversy surrounding the district attorney.
Correct. Judge McAfee ruled that DA Fonnie Willis's prosecution could continue, but he required prosecutor Nathan Wade to withdraw, citing an appearance of impropriety that stemmed from their relationship.
But crucially, the judge found no disqualifying conflict of interest. He just deemed the optics problematic.
Right. And the indictment itself is very broad. It includes charges against co-conspirators for false statements and unlawful acts aimed at disrupting the vote counting, including strategies for delaying the joint session of Congress on January 6.
And finally, the classified documents case in Florida.
Charged in June 2023. The core allegation there is the illegal retention of classified documents after leaving office, and then the subsequent obstruction of demands to return them. Later charges added the element of conspiring to delete surveillance video at Mar-a-Lago, which suggests an active attempt to conceal the movement of those documents.
Okay, we have to address the final critical element of this legal entanglement section. The historical relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the new correspondence released by the Oversight Committee.
Yeah, the sources confirm the historical relationship. Trump and Epstein socialized frequently throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, visiting each other's properties, flying on Epstein's jet multiple times. The relationship reportedly ended around 2004, and then Epstein was banned from Mar-a-Lago in 2007.
However, the correspondence released by Oversight Democrats in November 2025 painted a much, much darker picture regarding the knowledge of Epstein's crimes.
It did. The committee released this correspondence, and they explicitly stated it was striking a blow against what they termed the White House's Epstein cover-up.
And 2 emails really stand out.
They do. A 2011 email from Epstein stated that Trump spent hours at my house with a victim of sex trafficking and then referred to Trump as the dog that hasn't barked.
Cryptic language that implies some knowledge or awareness.
Yes. And the second email from 2019 was even more explicit about the nature of that knowledge.
What did it say?
In a 2019 email exchange with the author Michael Wolff, Epstein stated explicitly that Trump knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop.
Wow.
If that's substantiated, it raises extremely serious questions about the extent of Trump's knowledge of Epstein's criminal activities prior to the official end of their relationship and why this information was allegedly downplayed or concealed.
And we also have Ghislaine Maxwell's testimony related to this period.
Yes. Maxwell's testimony confirms that other people were asked for help. When she was asked if she remembered asking Trump for a letter for her defense, she said she didn't recall asking him, but she emphasized that Epstein also asked people himself directly.
But she did maintain she never saw Trump in any inappropriate setting.
She did. Nonetheless, the correspondence released by Congress elevates the entire discussion beyond just social acquaintance into the realm of potential knowledge and cover-up. So if the previous section detailed the legal conflicts driven by transactional power, this next segment really addresses the immediate, tangible effects of executive actions on the public, the chaos and policy disruption that resulted from this concentration of authority. And we have to begin with the government shutdown crisis.
Chaos is precisely the right word. We're talking about the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, which capped at 43 days and finally ended in November of 2025. What were the specific, immediate human and operational costs of that standoff?
The costs were immense, and they were deeply personal for hundreds of thousands of Americans. An estimated 900,000 federal workers were furloughed.
And another 700,000 were forced to work without pay.
That's right. And to give a specific example of the institutional damage, the IRS alone furloughed 50% of its staff. That's 34,000 employees, which crippled its ability to process taxes and refunds.
And the administration made the situation even worse by threatening to withhold back pay, forcing many workers into this state of economic jeopardy.
Absolutely. That threat forced furloughed workers to resort to high-interest bank loans. It led to a surge in demand for assistance programs across the D.C. region just to cover basic necessities like rent and groceries. This was a direct financial hardship imposed on federal employees, many of whom are not highly paid to begin with.
What other services saw the most profound disruption?
The Federal Aviation Administration, for one, was severely affected. The FAA initially ordered airlines to cut 4% of flights, but this was projected to ramp up to 10% by November 14th. That would cause major air travel disruption and, frankly, safety concerns.
And crucially, SNAP benefits, the food assistance program, were suspended.
Yes, which led to legal challenges, where the administration then petitioned the Supreme Court to continue freezing those benefits, directly impacting millions of vulnerable families.
So we saw government dysfunction translate instantly into stalled infrastructure, financial hardship for workers, and suspended food aid for the poor. The public consensus on who was to blame, it seemed complex, but ultimately it targeted the executive branch.
The political fallout was significant. Polls taken just 2 days before the shutdown found that 45% of voters would blame Republicans, compared to 32% blaming Democrats. Now, later polls showed the blame was sometimes diffuse.
33% blamed both sides.
Right. But still, 26% blamed Trump and the Republican Party, while only 19% blamed the Democratic Party. The party controlling the executive branch, which was responsible for the initial funding demands, bore the brunt of the political cost.
Okay, let's shift now to immigration policy. This is an area where executive action led to massive operational scale and just intense legal condemnation regarding due process.
The scale of enforcement has been unprecedented. By September 2025, 400,000 people were formally deported, and that's alongside the administration's claim of 1.6 million self-deportations.
And public opinion on this was volatile, wasn't it?
Very. While initial public support for deporting illegal immigrants had grown to a majority by January 2025, this support didn't last. By April of 2025, a majority of polls found that Americans felt the deportations went too far.
And the controversy often centered less on the enforcement itself and more on the systemic erosion of these long-standing legal protections.
That is the core legal concern. The administration faced sharp condemnation from federal judges, including some Trump appointees, for attempting to bypass established immigration courts, severely limiting due process, canceling legal representation grants for unaccompanied children, and summarily firing immigration judges who pushed back.
And judges warned that the measures being used for, say, terrorists or gang members were vague enough that they could easily be expanded to target other political or ethnic groups. The sources also specifically highlight this concerning practice of third-country deportations, sending individuals to countries they have no connection to whatsoever.
And this represents a major legal and humanitarian challenge. Obscure laws, like the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, were invoked to justify these actions.
What are some examples?
The sources cite deporting individuals to El Salvador's megaprisons, including people with no apparent criminal records, and also to African nations like Eswatini and Rwanda.
Both of which have troubling human rights records.
Very troubling. And deporting individuals there who are not citizens of those countries raises profound legal and ethical concerns about international law and basic humanitarian protections.
And when you erode due process like that, the risk of error, and thus the detention of actual U.S. citizens, becomes very real.
It does. The speed and lack of scrutiny in the ICE raids led to serious errors, inadvertently detaining U.S. citizens, including a disabled veteran and even a 15-year-old high school student.
And this led to serious concerns about racial profiling.
Yes, it prompted some Asian American citizens to resort to carrying their passports out of fear of ICE agents stopping them in public. I mean, that illustrates significant erosion of civil liberties right there.
Okay, finally, let's discuss the global impact of the tariff trade wars. What was the mechanism and the goal of these recent proposals?
The goal was explicitly protectionist. Trump pledged in his second inaugural address to immediately begin the overhaul of our trade system. He invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA.
Citing national emergencies like fentanyl trafficking.
Right, to justify imposing initial tariffs on trading partners. The specific proposals included a 10% universal tariff proposal and threats of even higher duties on certain goods.
And what does the economic analysis say about the impact of a universal 10% tariff?
The consensus among the economists cited in the material is that this proposal is globally destabilizing. The U.S. GDP overall could drop by -0.64%. For major trading partners, like Germany, the impact could be as mid as a 0.23% drop in their GDP.
And there was the threat of a 100% duty on imported vehicles,
Which could dramatically slow the adoption of electric vehicles in the U.S., since imported EVs currently account for roughly 30% of the market.
And this leads us back to this fundamental concept of protectionism, the lump of labor fallacy. We need to make sure we nail this down clearly for the listener.
The lump of labor fallacy is the erroneous notion that there's only a fixed amount of work to be done in an economy. So if a job appears in one place, it must have been taken from another.
A zero-sum game mentality.
Exactly. And economists argue that job churn due to foreign competition is actually much lower than the churn caused by domestic competition. But foreign competition is, quote, easier to demonize and target politically.
So protectionist policies are politically expedient because they target a visible external enemy, even if the real economic disruption is actually coming from domestic trends and automation.
Precisely. And the trade actions prompted these global responses. The EU threatened retaliation. India stated explicitly they would not bow down to U.S. trade policy demands. These tariffs risk triggering a cycle of retaliation that would ultimately damage U.S. export industries and increase costs for consumers here at home.
Okay, so we've established the pattern. Rhetorical warfare destroys shared truth, immunity claims shield power, and policy disruption creates chaos. Now, as we enter this final synthesis, let's connect this to the longer view, the deep economic and demographic trends that will shape the country regardless of who holds the executive office.
And we see a clear systemic risk where the concentration of private wealth and political power creates an environment that is just ripe for massive financial benefits for campaign backers.
Right.
This system, which we just saw manifest in the use of pardons, also works via policy decisions that are easily tailored to reward specific donors through things like government contracts, favorable tariffs, or regulatory changes.
And we have several specific examples of major donors whose business interests align directly with policies that have been pursued. Let's make that link explicit for everybody.
Okay, so consider major donors like NVIDIA and Hard Rock International, which are cited in the sources. NVIDIA, a leader in AI and chip manufacturing, lists policy issues like AI regulation, corporate sustainability standards, trade policy, and taxation as directly affecting their business.
And Hard Rock.
Hard Rock International cites trade and taxation as key concerns. And Peter Thiel founded Palantir Technologies, has seen its role as a major federal contractor grow dramatically, which highlights the opportunity for policy to benefit those who are close to power.
So in other words, targeted policy decisions, like a specific tariff or avoiding certain regulations, can function as a de facto reward for political investment. It ties policy directly to a donor's self-interest.
That is a transactional ecosystem, and we saw the most extreme manifestation of blending the executive office with personal business ventures with that cryptocurrency project.
The Trump meme coin venture. Walk us through that. Why did this raise such profound ethical and emoluments concerns?
Well, the mechanism itself created an immediate conflict of interest. Trump launched and promoted the Trump meme coin, and its market value briefly exceeded $5 billion in a matter of hours.
$5 billion.
And this coin is controlled by a Trump-owned company, CIC Digital LLC, which owned 80% of the coin's supply. So this means the executive was directly promoting a financial instrument from which he stood to gain astronomical personal profit.
And the ethical alarms went off immediately.
Of course. Ethics experts and watchdogs heavily criticized the venture, especially regarding the potential violation of the Constitution's Foreign Emoluments Clause, given that foreign governments or entities could easily purchase and hold this coin.
But the most disturbing connection was the link between owning the coin and seeking exclusive access to the politician.
Absolutely. The sources note that Trump promoted exclusive access to him for the largest holders of Trump. Certain buyers stated explicitly they bought the coins or entered the dinner contest with the intention of securing an action by Mr. Trump to affect United States policy.
That is the ultimate example of transactional power. You're circumventing traditional lobbying for a direct crypto policy pipeline.
The purchase of a digital asset is treated as a direct investment in the expectation of political influence.
Okay, now let's pivot to the two massive demographic and economic challenges that are going to require long-term systemic solutions, regardless of who is in charge. That's the millennial retirement crisis and the caregiving burden.
Yes, the sources outline a looming retirement crisis for the millennial generation, those born between 1981 and 1996. They face a severe challenge in financing a retirement that's sufficient for their working years' standard of living. It's really a systemic failure rooted in timing and structure.
And they seem to be battling several distinct generational headwinds all at the same time, creating a perfect storm.
First, timing. They entered the job market during the Great Recession, which researchers have proven leads to long-lasting negative effects on lifetime earnings potential.
And second, structure.
Second, structure. They're dealing with a labor market that shifted dramatically away from defined benefit pensions, this secure traditional retirement system, toward defined contribution plans, primarily 401ks.
And the difference between those two plans is absolutely critical, isn't it?
It is. A defined benefit plan, a pension, places the responsibility for ensuring sufficient retirement funds squarely on the employer. A defined contribution plan, a 401k, places that responsibility squarely on the individual.
So if millennials undersave or if their retirement funds take a huge hit in a recession,
the burden is entirely theirs. And because they have fewer traditional pensions, they have much less security.
And on top of that, this crisis is disproportionately affecting minority households.
That is the underlying structural inequality. A greater share of the millennial cohort is non-white, and minority households generally have substantially less wealth than white households, even when you control for similar income and education levels.
What does that gap look like?
A black household has an average net worth that's $124,000 less than a white household with the same income and education. And this gap is stubbornly persistent and potentially increasing, which just exacerbates the overall retirement shortfall.
Okay, let's discuss the second monumental long-term pressure, the growing caregiving burden.
By 2050, the number of very old people needing care is going to grow dramatically. Currently, about 10 million Americans over 65 rely on unpaid care from family and friends, and this is a massive hidden cost to our economy.
What are the economic consequences of all this unpaid labor?
Caregivers, who are predominantly family or friends, are about 9 percentage points less likely to be employed because of their responsibilities. They sacrifice an estimated $67 billion a year in wages today.
$67 billion.
And that figure is projected to more than double by 2050 as the population continues to age.
And just like the retirement crisis, this burden is not distributed equally.
Correct. The sources indicate that the caregiving burden depresses labor force participation much more severely for college-educated minorities, reflecting historical patterns of who is expected to bear the burden of familial care.
And these are major societal costs that will demand comprehensive structural policy solutions.
Yes, solutions that, given the trends we've discussed, present another massive opportunity for political power to be leveraged for targeted gains in the healthcare or financial sectors.
Okay, let's zoom out. So what does all this mean for you, the citizen, just trying to make sense of the modern American experiment?
We've navigated a really comprehensive landscape, and it's painted a picture of systemic stress. We're talking an unprecedented intentional attack on the concept of truth itself, constitutional challenges to the very limits of executive power, a transactional system where personal wealth is deeply entangled with policy outcomes and clemency, and severe real-world disruptions caused by government dysfunction and mass deportations.
Yeah.
The sources remind us that the core mission of American democracy relies entirely on informed citizens making judgments based on agreed-upon facts.
And if political power is actively deployed rhetorically, legally, and financially to destroy that basis,
then truth becomes a negotiable asset, and politics risks becoming purely transactional.
Yeah.
You pay for the outcome you want, whether that's a pardon or a favorable tariff.
We started with Thomas Paine's stark warning against rulers who are poisoned by importance, rendering them unfit to govern. We end here, recognizing that the battle is no longer against a single king residing overseas, but against the decay of the shared reality that allows us to hold any ruler accountable.
Critical thinking, recognizing the rhetorical moves, And insisting on verifiable facts is really your only reliable defense in this environment.
Now you have the receipts, the facts, the historical context, and the economic mechanisms of the chaos. Just try to keep them organized when the next wave of Firehose of Falsehoods hits the zone. That's the challenge ahead.
Our mission is complete, but your analysis has just begun.
For Neon Core Media, we thank you for diving deep with us. Our sister series, The Debate, is sure to be putting this audio under the scope soon, so make sure you use these facts wisely. Until next time.